Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I am Dr. Işılay Gürsu.
I'm Dr. Peter Cherry.
Welcome to the Heritage Türkiye podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA.
And today we're very happy to have with us Aylin Orbaşlı. And Aylin Orbaşlı is the Deputy Chair of the British Institute at Ankara and Professor of Architecture at Oxford Brookes University. Aylin also works internationally as an independent consultant, advising on the protection, conservation and management of historic places and sites. So, Aylin, welcome.
Thank you very much.
First question for you then. How did you first become interested in heritage preservation and work?
Ooh, long story, and it goes back quite a way. I grew up in Izmir on the west coast of Turkey amongst archaeological sites. So I think even as a kid, we were visiting all the major sites on sort of quite regular basis. And my mother had a copy of George Bean, and we would travel around these sites with George Bean. And I think so. When I came to university to study architecture, I already knew that I was more interested in historic conservation than I was in sort of designing buildings. So I always chose elective subjects on conservation. So it's been there a long time.
Because there are not many architects who are interested in archaeology, right?
Not huge, no.
And because there is a deficit always, and there is a huge demand from archaeological projects to have more architects on board. You're also interested in heritage management plans, and you are one of the very first people who introduced the heritage plans in Turkey. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in preparing site management plans and how it came to life in Turkey?
Okay, again, I think most architects working on archaeological sites in Turkey and elsewhere come there to do the drawings and the planning, but quite soon they get involved in a more spatial, strategic way of organising the site or designing a dig house or working out where the paths go. So it's a sort of natural transition, I think, for architects on archaeological sites. And I was, through my PhD, I was studying heritage management, and particularly in the urban context, but looking at how you managed tourism in historic towns, which again was a growing issue in Turkey at that time. Places like Antalya were seeing the effects of how historic towns were being conserved for tourism. So it was the natural combination of sort of spatial management of visitors and to looking at how that manifested itself on archaeological sites.
And we're very fortunate that you are here in Ankara at the moment. You're normally based in London and Oxford. But another important aspect to that is that you actually first studied architecture at Middle East Technical University. So a question then is how you think training in architecture in Turkey, how that kind of helped you in developing the heritage management plans that you've been working on?
I think it did hugely because compared to my experience of being an educator in a school of architecture for almost 25 years now in England, there was a much stronger tradition in Turkey of archaeology and architecture. And if you look at most archaeological excavations teams, they're often got architecture partners. So where the archaeologists would be from Ankara Üniversitesi, there would often be a fellow or, teammate architect from one of the schools of architecture, whichever one that was. And each group would bring their respective students to sites in the summer. So it was embedded. So I think we knew we had those opportunities from very early on, which I wouldn't think my students in Oxford Brookes would have, would know that they could work on an archaeological excavation, for example. So I think it's much more embedded in the Turkish architecture training.
Mm.
When you were visiting sites in Izmir with the book of George Bean, I think George Bean was not concerned with the pressure of tourism that's put on these sites, right? So you're also working in the context of tourism and how it impacts historic places and sites. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes at play?
Hugely. And I mean, if you look at the birth of heritage management, whether it's the discipline, whether it's UNESCO requesting heritage management plans for World Heritage Sites, it all is born out of, the origin of it is that it's about managing visitors. So if you look at early publications, it often talks about visitor management. And an early visitor management was like, how can we get them through fast enough or not putting pressure on our archaeological sites? In Turkey, Ephesus is one of the earliest examples where congestion became and remains a major issue, trying to get large crowds, particularly with the cruise ships, bus loads, peak times, and people moving through. Greece experienced many of the similar problems. So congestion and managing large numbers is always an issue thing. But I think what we moved to with heritage management was to say it doesn't matter if a site has a lot of visitors or not very many visitors. In fact, they all need management, and you all need to anticipate visitors, different forms of visitation, different numbers, but they all need some form of heritage management, visitor management in that.
Can we just dig deeper into what's involved in making a plan for a historic site or a heritage site? What sort of questions are you dealing with? How are you formulating those plans?
Yeah, I think, again, the origin of heritage management is that there were disciplinary, and still is disciplinary silos. So, the archaeologists, they have, they've got their agenda, they're trying to, discover something and make sense of something, and they've got research questions, and they try and respond to those research questions through excavation and so forth. And then you've got people in tourism ministries or tourism departments or tour operators who want to monetize sites and see it as a tourism potential and potential. And a lot of regional economies, particularly the west of Turkey, depend on tourism. I mean, I've worked in Jordan quite a bit, and the economy of Petra, it's part of the national economy. The money coming into Petra is part of the national economy. So the visitor numbers are taken very seriously at very high levels often. But they're not interested in the science. They're not interested in the research questions. Same time, I come from an architecture conservation background, and we see as archaeologists as destroying things and want to conserve buildings, and they want to remove layers. Whereas if you're in urban heritage or a sort of a monument, you want to restore it. You don't want to dismantle it to find out more about it. You're sort of restoring it. So there are these different disciplinary interests amongst. And I think one discipline we often sort of oversee is nature conservation, environmentalists, biodiversity. There are often archaeological sites are also a huge sense of biodiversity. And one thing a heritage management plan can do is bring these different disciplines together to work together. So it creates a framework in which everyone still has disciplinary obligations and roles, but it makes sure that none of those impinges on the others. So decisions being made regarding archaeology doesn't impact on conservation or nature conservation and so forth. So it's finding a balance. It's negotiating the different interests. And to do that in the sort of most scientific way is through understanding what's the values of the site, the significance of the site. So ultimately, you don't negatively impact on what's really important about the site and what makes it attractive to science, what makes it attractive to visitors, and tourism and so forth. So it's a balancing negotiation exercise, really.
I was thinking of art of negotiation when you were explaining all this situation. Can I ask a little bit more specifically about the sites that you worked at? For instance, you worked at Ani, which is a site at the Armenian-Turkey border, and Çatalhöyük, which is a site in central Anatolia. So can you maybe give us a little bit of more context into the sites that you worked in?
Yes, I think my very early career, straight after university, was in Western Turkey, again with classical sites at Bergama. So moving 10 years later to sort of the Çatalhöyük context was a major shift for me, because I was suddenly in much less visited sites, much less visibly impressive sites, and often sites located within quite marginalized communities. And I think that's That's the real thing. You're working with very different types of community groups with very different expectations than you would, say, in Western Turkey. And I think what we tried to do in both those plans was to really engage with those communities, but also understand their sort of state of marginalization. And I think, Ani, whatever you do, it's on the edge of a country. You can't get more marginal if you've tried. You've got nowhere to go. You have your connectivity to the rest of the country. Even the nearest city of Kars is quite distant and quite fragmented. So archaeological sites are not going to solve all social problems by a long way. But I think the sort of community interest and connectivity becomes a lot more important at those sites. In the bigger sites where there's a lot of tourism, then most of the sort of local economy has sort of sorted itself out. They've had the benefit from tourism. The more entrepreneurial ones have opened shops and hotels and motels and guest houses and cafes and restaurants. They're benefiting from it anyway. They just say, just keep the site, get the visitors coming in, and Side, for example, or Selçuk, they're reaping the benefits of that tourism boom. So they don't see. I don't think it's the same sort of environment or same sort of context that you have in these smaller sites, more remote sites, where there is a link and an attachment to the sites and sort of expectation when outsiders come in. And it doesn't matter if it's an international excavation or a Turkish excavation. Someone coming from Ankara to Ani is an outsider. They're as good as a foreigner coming in, and it's sort of these people from the other place, more powerful place, and what can they bring us? They're coming with power, and I think those relationships become a lot more important, but also much more difficult to navigate.
Yes, yeah, I remember visiting Ani quite a few years ago. It's really an incredible place, actually. How did you get involved with working with Ani, actually?
It was, all these things happened by accident, but there was a joint UNESCO-UNDP program for economic and regional development for Eastern Anatolia. It was a sentence of a name for the project, but the UNESCO partners had decided with the ministry, the Department of Antiquities here, to focus on site management plan as a means of sort of developing the site, bringing it back into the sort of spotlight. And it was sort of very experimental. It was and it was part of capacity building, both in the Kars region as well as in the department here. And interestingly, the pathway led to a UNESCO nomination, which it wasn't on the agenda at that point. That point, it really was 2010, 2011, was to say, what can we do for this site? There are all these fragmented projects. There's donors come in like World Monument Fund, restoring buildings. But what's the overall, is there a strategy? Is there a coherent plan? I think in that case, the management plan became the sort of glue that again pulled all these things together.
Yeah. I mean, another thing to say, actually, is so you've worked a lot, we've talked mostly here about kind of archaeological sites in Western Turkey or in parts of Eastern Anatolia, but you've also worked a lot on cities. So what lessons can be learnt from working in urban spaces that can be transferred to historical archaeological sites?
I think what I'm learning, being both an architect working in that sort of urban planning realm, so I'm very sort of well aware of what urban planning entails, master planning, zoning, and also not just in spatial terms, but also in policy terms, in sort of what urban policy means. Obviously, urban sites are very different in that they have very different ownership patterns. And, if you're working in urban heritage, you think, aren't archaeological sites lucky they have a fence around it? They know their border, boundaries. They don't need to worry about land rights, and it might be someone's field, but that's sort of the maximum. Whereas in a historic town, everyone owns their own property. It's their home. The decisions you're making are directly impacting on people's people's homes and lived environment. I think what we're sort of not looking at sufficiently is that there's actually a convergence of urban and archaeological site, and in many places, particularly settlements on the periphery or on the edge of an archaeological site, are actually part of that heritage management. You know, these villages that are sort of sitting on the edge of sites, ultimately as things develop, they are part of the planning. I don't think you can think of Ephesus now without considering what's happening in Selçuk and visitor movements through that wider geography. So you're getting into bigger spatial planning. Going back to Petra, the town of Wadi Musa is at the gate. You know, to get into the site, every visitor passes through this town. So the planning, the character, the movement of people, where the car parking happens, where the roads happen, where you put green parts, you know, all that is actually part of the heritage management of Petra. So you end up doing some very urban heritage things, even in an archaeological heritage context. And I think you can also see the sites as settlements, not in terms of settlement archaeology, but in modern day settlements with visitor facilities, car parks, dig houses. You know, they are in themselves mini settlements, and they're very spatial. And there's a lot of, you know, town planning, urban planning has been around for decades, and there's some really good theories developed around it, but also some really good toolkits. So I think we can borrow more from urban planning toolkits when we're looking at sites and how we're, you know, understanding topography, geography, geology in planning sites, and where we're putting our new interventions in it, how we're moving people around them. And we can learn from those disciplines. And more importantly, I think from a sort of public archaeology point of view, is that, again, there's some really good toolkits and experiences of participatory planning. So, you know, we can adapt those. We can't copy them. There are different realities, but there's a lot we can use in terms of methodologies that are actually very effective and tried and tested. And
definitely. And you just mentioned Petra, and you are currently working in different places all around Middle East. So maybe we can ask, like, what kind of parallels you can draw between your more recent experiences in working these countries and Turkey. Are there any similarities, or what are the main differences in terms of heritage management practices?
Yes, it's been, I've sort of worked in two different contexts, predominantly one in Jordan with Petra, and probably a country that's economically quite a bit behind Turkey, and its conditions and realities, and social realities in particular. And then, in contrast, Saudi Arabia, where actually there's, you know, a lot of wealth, so any suggestion you make can pretty much be funded, which, I mean, it's a huge, huge luxury that you can say, I want a fence there, I want a visitor centre there, and the money, the money is available. So
Wow.
in that sense, it's a luxury, but the issues can be the same. Remote sites, how do you get people there? How do the local communities see visitors? Some want them, some don't want them, some think they want them, but when they get them, they're less sure. And so a lot of the issues are the same. I think in the Middle East, the tribal structure is much more evident. And working with that tribal structure is a lot more complex. It's not up to me to do. It's others in the team who are much closer to that social reality who undertake those tasks. We've looked at some and I thought Ani was sort of on the edge, but I've now seen a lot more sites, a lot more on the edge. And so I think in the middle of the desert, sort of sites where, literally, in the middle of nowhere sites, and how you animate those, how you both protect them from looting or any other means. You can't just put fences around the desert. And it also impacts on the amazing landscape setting. So how do you fence something that has such a wonderful setting? But if you don't do some form of protection, how do you protect rock art that's spread over huge valley systems that are all part of a World Heritage Site? So I think from a heritage management point of view, it is always about complexity, and it's about understanding the complexity of each site, each place, and each situation, and finding ways in which to solve that complexity to create a coherent sort of management plan for it. But I think another lesson for me from that region is that a realization when I got into the region is just like how far Turkey is ahead of the game, and that, you know, we're giving example, you know, when we're talking about best practice, it's like, look at this site in Turkey, look at, you know, the heritage management legislation in particular is way ahead of many countries. And I think particularly in the Middle East, Turkey is something they can aspire to. You know, if you say in England in Stonehenge we do this, it's a pipe dream. It's like, that's England, you know, you have rain, you have green, you have this, you have that, you have, you know, school kids who come and, you know, there's a whole different cultural infrastructure that's already in place. Whereas when you start giving them examples from Turkey, it's a lot more, we go there on holiday, we see it, we can do that, they're like us, you know, if they can do it, maybe we can do it. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the sort of value of what's available, you know, what's already happening here, and that it can be a sort of best practice for the wider region. And I mean, the recommendation obviously is that keep on the best practice, you know, remain that example to be sort of made example.
That's really interesting to hear, actually. I guess that takes me on to another question, which is, what challenges, therefore, do you think there are in Turkey in terms of kind of cultural heritage and protection? What are the major challenges, anyway?
There are huge challenges, as in everywhere. I mean, first, obviously, is finance. I mean, a biggest challenge I think we all know is that there's just so much heritage. You know, how the usual thing, you know, wherever you throw a spade, you find something. It's all important, it's all interesting, but, you know, how do we reach all of it? How do we spread very small budgets? I mean, anywhere in the world, culture budget is the thinnest slice, and heritage is a thinner slice even in that, you know, in the culture budget after music and arts and everything else, you know, heritage is still even the thinnest slice. So funds are always, you know, funding, you know, you can have great ideas, you can have wonderful management plans that tell you to do all sorts of things, but if you can't achieve that within the finances and the means available, then it's not useful. So, you know, it's been one of, you know, outside of Saudi Arabia, working in sites, you're always looking at solutions that can be funded easily within existing budgets with small tweaks, and rather than saying, oh, well, there's a donor funding, you could do this big, you know, but really thinking about the finances of how you can sort of achieve something within the means that are available in that locality. So I think that's always going to be a big issue. Obviously, awareness. You know, we've talked about this a lot over the years. You know, how do you get local communities more aware of their heritage, more engaged with it, things, local politics, and local, I mean, and that's probably the most difficult to solve, and one that's very dynamic at times, and at other times it's very ingrained in that, you know, things have been happening in a place for hundreds of years. And what we're trying to disrupt is actually patterns that have been established. You know, if you have two villages, two settlements, two tribes near a site, invariably you will find that they are in dispute with one another for, you know, centuries-old land disputes. So, you know, that those two groups or those two villages have always been, I don't know, arch enemies, or there's always a hostility between. So you're not going to change that by coming and, you know, managing an archaeological site. So the things you have to navigate, I think you've also got to accept that, again, they have to take place within existing political, socio-political frameworks and so forth. So I think, so those are the sort of biggest challenges.
You are currently in Ankara because we organized a workshop on public archaeology together with UCL at Bilkent University on the 17th and 18th of October. I should probably also mention the dates.
Good.
So we had these 2 days of intense lectures about public archaeology. How would you say that those discussions have a place in your work? Were they inspirational or were they some parallels? And you also gave a wonderful talk at the beginning of the conference. So I'm asking like an overall assessment of the conference and the public archaeology approaches.
I think it was an amazing conference, and I think it was really interesting because which these things don't always achieve, is that it brought people from different geographical contexts, different academic contexts in terms of disciplinary, there was anthropologists speaking, there was archaeologists, architects, town planners. So there were very different disciplinary perspectives on it. But I think there was also different national perspectives on it, sort of the nationals, like, how you view something from an English Western point of view. And it can be even different if a German person is operating a site and they can actually have very different worldview on things. But obviously there were a lot of speakers from Turkey and they are very much embedded in the reality of Turkey. So they see things from different perspectives as well. And I think particularly for public archaeology, that's really, really important. And I think the more we hear about each other's perspectives, the more open we can be to these different viewpoints and these different ways people see things and places and sites. And I think that lies at the heart of public archaeology. If you can't see the other viewpoint, you're not going to be successful.
I think we should also just say there that Işılay was one of the main organisers of that conference. So, thanks very much for all the organisation. But that also brings us on to a question more generally about the BIA. So obviously you're also here in capacity as Deputy Chair of the BIA. So what part do you think the BIA can play in developing more sustainable heritage protection and development?
Well, I think this is our shifting role at the BIA here in Turkey. And I was brought onto the board, which until that time was mostly archaeologists or political scientists, as the first, it's quite a number of years ago now, as the first board member who did heritage management. And Işılay was hired around that time in her first position at the Institute, looking at heritage management projects. And I think this was on the back of what we did at Çatalhöyük, which was a British excavation at the time that was, the first management plan and looking at sort of broader heritage management, public archaeology in a sort of more formal project sense. So I think the Institute had started building that capacity at that time. So I think in that sense, it was really important to carry that on and to show that the role of foreign institutions in Turkey have other roles beyond just digging holes in the ground and having these big excavations and publishing a lot of books and volumes and sort of creating the science. And say that you can't just excavate, you've also got to look after these sites, you've got to think about the bigger picture, and sort of lead by doing, I think has been the Institute's thing is, do the research, do this on the sites. We try all the excavations that are now have some funding from the BIA. We try and encourage that they're doing some form of heritage management as part of the package, that they're doing public archaeology. We separately fund projects that just look at public archaeology at sites. So it might be sites that have been excavated in the past, but things they're now looking at other forms of heritage management and public engagement. So again, I think we're building a good track record of doing that. And I think the task for us now is to stay abreast with what's happening globally. And because of our international makeup and our links and our networks with other British institutes, other academic institutions, and a sort of quite multidisciplinary board, that we can sort of capture what's happening in real time and make sure that that is brought into Turkey and sort of starts getting practiced at sites, including collaboration with Turkish colleagues here and Turkish sites here.
Great.
Thank you so much, Eileen. It's great to have you on board and also at our podcast. And I have learned a lot from Eileen over the years, and I want to thank you for your generosity in sharing this knowledge as well and being with us here today too.
It's been a great pleasure, and thank you very much for the organisation of the conference, which was an important 10-year milestone after the first major public archaeology conference that the BIA had organised.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So until next time, which is in 3 or 4 weeks, görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz. Thank you.
Thanks.